Thanks all for being here in so large numbers. Very exciting. Today, I want to talk a bit about how we go about getting spatial insight into our models' accuracies. Because as Tomislav Hengel just introduced, this is a big thing in machine learning in general, because it's not always, these new models are, quickly remove this thingy, no, it doesn't work. These models aren't great in extrapolating and in predicting into unknown areas, but sometimes the data is just what you have, and you're not always, you can ask, can't really ask for more data sometimes. First, something quickly. My computer stopped. Help. Sorry for that. I've just lost my mouse. All right, just quickly something about me. I did my undergrad and PhD studies in molecular biology in Wageningen, Netherlands. So quite unrelated to the stuff I'm doing right now. So about 3 years ago, I moved to Zurich to work in Thomas Krauter's lab. And there I got into more into the geospatial modeling aspects, and mainly working on soil biodiversity. And as a plus, and a small side note, Switzerland is definitely the prettiest country one could live. So that's a big bonus of moving here. And today's topic will be mostly focusing on a paper that we published about a year and a half ago. A few of you might have seen it, about soil nematode abundances, where we show that they are present in higher numbers in the subarctic regions compared to the tropics. But today, I mostly want to focus on the inaccuracies of those models and how end users of those maps could be informed by these inaccuracies and how to get these spatial insights into the model uncertainties. As a very quick overview of the sampling or the methodology, it all starts with soil sampling and hand counting all the samples. And that's something that few of us data scientists might sometimes forget how much actual hardcore work there's involved in getting all these data. So for nematodes, for example, one has to sample a soil core, take it to the lab, hand count the number of nematodes per 100 grams of soil, for example, and that's just a very tedious process. And this was repeated about 6,800 times to collate a global data set. And this data set we combined with a stack of environmental covariate layers to combine into a random forest model to make a prediction map. And for most of our modeling, we use Google Earth Engine, though we also use R for some larger data sets that we have available. And the main reason that we use Google Earth Engine is that it's easy to work with colleagues on the same scripts and data. It's easy to share large data files. There's a lot of data available for free, really thousands of terabytes of data from MODIS satellites or Sentinel satellites. And it's fairly fast and scalable, meaning that producing many maps at the same time can be done fairly quickly. So for example, the approach I just lined out, going from a data set of about 10,000 samples to a global map at 1 kilometer scale takes just under 20 minutes. Earth Engine is accessible over a web editor, just in a browser, but I mostly use the Python API as it's way more powerful if you want to do a bit more high throughput modeling or grid searching or bootstrapping, as I will line out later. Today, most of the talk will be about extrapolating. As Tom already lined out, extrapolation is definitely one of the key pitfalls of machine learning in geospatial modeling. And secondly, I'll focus a bit of how we get insight into the spatial insight into model inaccuracies. So the whole idea behind our approach is that we want to know where our model is extrapolating in a spatial way, because this can inform users of the map to say something about, well, maybe we can't use these predictions in these regions with that much accuracy. And I may just skip this slide because it's the exact same as Tom just showed, but essentially it means that random forest can't really predict outside its sampled range. But the main question is, where is this happening in a spatial sense? So in a methodology as we used, we have about 70 covariate layers. And here is an example. We take all the frequency plot of the global mean annual temperature, ranging from -25C to plus 35C. And we superimpose on that our sample data set here in orange. And in a fairly simplistic way, one could say everything between these dashed lines can be considered as interpolated or extrapolated. So here in orange, everything below 29.2 or above minus 16.5C is considered to be interpolated, and everything outside that range is considered to be extrapolated. And this process can be repeated for all the other covariates, like here being precipitation per year, EVI, aridity index, etc., and for all the covariates that are included in the model. That can then be used to create an image to have the proportional value of bands that are within or outside this interpolation range. And this shows a pattern that we were kind of expecting, because most of our data are not in the in Europe and in the US. We almost have no samples in the Sahara or other more drier regions. So these are places where our model is more extrapolating. It also helps to identify conditions that are undersampled. For example, we have fairly few samples from some ranges from the human development layers or depth to bedrock layers. But for example, EVI and NDVI are bands that are almost completely covered. This then can be used to mask regions that are considered to be extrapolated. So this is the final map. Then masking all pixels that have fewer than 95% interpolated shows that a large proportion of the planet of this model is extrapolating in those regions. And depending on the threshold you set, you go down in the range of extrapolation. And this is something that an end user could decide anywhere from 10 to 99% of interpolation. But perhaps this approach could be considered to be a bit simplistic, because it's not necessarily whether a value is within the sampled range, but it's also a combination of all these interactions of covariates. So for example, temperature and moisture and solar radiation have a strong interaction with one another. So ideally, one would assess the extrapolation in a n-dimensional space or a hypercube with the number of dimensions equal to the number of covariates. But this is extremely computationally intensive. As a quick example, with just 20 covariates, one would have 20 factorial combinations. So that's 2 to the power 18 combinations for every single pixel across the globe. And this is something that at least we currently can't compute, because it's just too intense. So to approach this, we came up with a methodology where we first reduce the dimensionality into PC space. We take the first so many axes explaining a set percentage of variation. And for example, in this example case, I would use 90% of variation explained, which needs 16 axes. And then we compute the convex hull coordinates of all these bivariate combinations of all the PC axes. So this is a total of 120 combinations, which is a far more manageable number of interactions to compute. And then we test whether a pixel value falls within or outside this convex hull, and pixels that fall within the convex hull are considered to be interpolated, and those outside are considered to be extrapolated in this combination of PC axes. And that's repeated for all the combinations. So this is an image that represents the combinations of PC1 and PC2 of the composite image. And superimposed on that, we show the sample points. You can simply draw a convex hull around this, and all pixels, again, that are falling within this convex hull considered to be interpolated, and all points here in blue are considered to be extrapolated. This process is then repeated for all the other combinations, which leaves us with a quite a fancy plot, which then can be used to calculate the proportion of PC combinations interpolated or extrapolated in every pixel. And both of these interpolations versus extrapolation assessments are fairly quick in Google Earth Engine. It takes about 15 to 30 minutes to compute these, and we find them very useful to highlight regions where our models are less accurate or less trustworthy, if you want. And again, this map can be used then to mask out pixels where regions are perhaps more extrapolated. There's a few possible modifications. Just to give you an idea of what we're currently working on is instead of doing this assessment across all the variables, one could only take the top so many predictors from the variable importance metrics. One could score by weight, for example, by the percentage explained for each PC axis or the relative importance of each of the variable. And what would be a nice addition would be to take into account the distance to the centroid or the border of the convex hull, so that the pixel that's more extrapolated or less extrapolated are weighted differently. Then the second part, a few notes on how we computed per pixel confidence intervals to help interpretation of the results, because sometimes single accuracy metrics like R² or RMSE aren't very useful or informative for global scale models, because they give a single metric for about 200 million terrestrial pixels. And to go about this, we apply a stratified bootstrapping approach. And just as a very short refresher, bootstrapping is essentially sampling with replacement. So we create an n number of bootstrap sample sets where each sample has been, each point has been drawn and replaced to create 100 different iterations of the data set. But to ensure equal representation of all the different environmental conditions on the planet, we weight the sampling by area of each of the biomes. And here on the right, you see the terrestrial biome classification scheme. Sorry for this. Yeah. So here on the left, you see that there is, if you resample weighted by each of these different colors, you get a different bootstrap sample size for each.
Johan, I think you've stopped sharing your screen.
Oh,
because I can't see it just now.
No, it should be back on now. It should be back on now, I hope.
Yeah, that works, thanks.
Okay, sorry for that. And here, in this little video, I show 100 different iterations of each of the bootstrap samples, which shows that some points are sampled more often than others. And these data are then used to create a stack of classified images equal to the number of bootstrap samples. So, for example, for the nematode paper, we used 100 different iterations. And this stack of images is then reduced to a single image using either a mean reducer, a confidence interval, or standard deviation. And these then provide per pixel estimates of confidence. So this is a mean image across these 100 iterations, showing a fairly similar pattern as the total image map. And here on the left bottom, you see the lower 2.5 percentile interval and an upper 97.5 interval. In other words, between these two maps falls 95% of the bootstrap confidence interval. Then we can also use these to create a map of standard deviation or the coefficient of variation to express the standard deviation in the percentage of the mean, which again shows that some regions are where we have fewer samples have a larger relative variation. So to wrap up, some key take-home messages. We think that with creating spatial insights into this model inaccuracy, we can help the end users of the maps to interpret the final models. And by mapping extrapolation, we can highlight regions of this uncertainty. And by bootstrapping, we can provide per pixel confidence intervals. And as a very quick last note, all the code and data of this study is available on GitLab under this link or this QR code. And in hopefully not too much of a time, we will have a more streamlined version of this approach published somewhere publicly. And with that, I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thanks, Johan. Hang on. Okay, so if someone wants to put a question or two in the chat, we can probably fit 1 or 2 questions. Kudos to Johan for staying under his time limit. Do we have any questions for Johan very quickly? Perhaps a 1-minute question.
I see a question popping up from Tom Hengel in the Q&A sheet.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm a little lost in the chat right now.
Yeah, so Tom asked whether I've used the GEE or Earth Engine toolbox in R to fit or compute models. The short answer is yes, but I quickly stopped because I found the communication between the two not ideal. And the syntax between R and JavaScript, where Earth Engine works, is a bit different. For me, it's much easier to do it in Python. But maybe it has been a year or two since I last tried, so maybe by now the package is a bit more streamlined.